memory, the ghost of the love you took from me. Where our love used to be, only shadows from the past I see. Time can't seem to erase the vision of your smiling face. Though you found someone new, I can't get over you. There's a ghost in my house, I can't hide from the ghost of your love that's inside. It keeps on haunting me, just keeps on reminding me.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Way podcast, and I'm joined today by journalist, broadcaster and TV executive Stuart Grosgrove. Stuart, thank you for joining us.
Thank you indeed, it's a pleasure.
And we're going to here to talk about your book Detroit 67, the year that changed soul.
Yes.
So you're, fair enough to say you're a soul fanatic.
Absolutely, and obsessive, and proudly so, yeah.
So how did you get into soul music?
Well, soul music's been something that's been a kind of recurring passion in my entire life, almost since I was a kind of young teenager. I grew up in Letham in Perth. My sister was a first generation mod in Scotland, and kind of was in the kind of scooter scene and things like that, and she firstly introduced me to what was then probably early R&B music. So it was things like Howlin' Wolf, it was Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Lee Dorsey, things like that. Some of it was actually quite raw in terms of, the kind of the sound of it, quite gut bucket kind of R&B. And gradually, of course, a lot of that smoothed out when the Motown scene came in the mid-60s, and that was a much more kind of popular, joyous, kind of maybe even commercial form of African-American music. But I'd kind of grown up with all of that, and so that was the first spark of an interest. By the age of 16, it was kind of starting to dominate my life, and from then on it's been the consistent thing. I mean, that and maybe actually St Johnstone Football Club are the two big consistents in my life, not apart from family and things like that, but yeah, it's been a lifelong passion. The book itself actually took several years, maybe 5 years, to kind of fully kind of research and write and whatever. And even that is maybe underestimating it a little bit, because I did a PhD in American history. I spent a lot of time in the States, and I've been a collector in the rare northern soul scene for certainly since I was about 18-year-old. So you accrue knowledge and understanding and awareness of kind of people and names and places, and the city of Detroit is writ large within that. I mean, it's a fundamentally important place for the whole of African American culture, but particularly the music scene. And so, I'd visited it several times, and when I was a PhD student in America, I wasn't in Detroit, but I was certainly in America, and was staying in touch with the music scene and whatever. So that was the kind of overall sort of vantage point of how I got into it. But I think maybe you can probably detect a wee bit of the kind of influence of my television thinking in the book, because the book is actually quite formatted in the way that TV often formats itself. So basically, it's Detroit 67, the year that changed soul, and it follows the biography of the city of Detroit in the year 1967, and it has 12 chapters, January, February, March, all the way through to December of that year. And it chooses that year because many of the big strands of society and social history of America are coming to fruition in that year.
Pivotal year.
Pivotal year, yes. I mean, the rise of the war in Vietnam, the summer urban riots, the FBI's tailing of Martin Luther King, leading to his assassination the following year. So there's all sorts of these big social history things going on, which always have some kind of locus within the city of Detroit. And within Detroit's own history, of course, it has the worst urban riots in its modern time in July of 1967. And it's the year where Tammy Terrell collapses on stage with a brain hemorrhage and breaks up the Marvin Gaye-Tammy Terrell duet. The Supremes are imploding and falling out with each other and eventually break up that year. Florence Ballard, who ultimately becomes the tragic figure within the book, actually ends her career at Motown in that year. So there's so many things going on. I mean, it's immense. It's a big book. It's 700 pages. It's a beast. You
say it took for 5 years or more, and
it took you 5 years to read it.
The research is astonishing, really. if you were to say, oh, it's a book about soul music, it's so much more, because the kind of social political history thing going on. And also, most people would say if you're going to write a book that concentrates on Motown mainly in terms of the music, you would maybe do it at the start, but this is at a time where it's all beginning to unravel. It feels that way.
Yeah, it does, and it feels like quite a lot of the kind of certainties that had once held the city together. I mean, quite interestingly, that at the very beginning of the story, Motown, or rather the city of Detroit, has had a relatively successful 2 or 3 years prior to that. It was actually being talked about in, the news magazines as being the model city, being organised, but under the then mayor of Detroit, a guy called Jerome Kavanagh, who was an Irish-American mayor who had many similarities to John F. Kennedy, from the same community, young, quite charismatic man, Democrat, and Kavanagh had been able to kind of shape Detroit, and one of his great successes was that he'd won more money from federal inner city poverty programs than any other mayor comparatively across the whole of the United States, more than Chicago, more than LA, whatever. And that had helped the inner city struggle in Detroit, at least helped the kind of safety net, if you like, of quite a lot of particularly young unemployed people in ghetto conditions and things like that. But the war in Vietnam, as it escalated, took more money out of domestic politics and moved it into the military and into this foreign war that was endless and endlessly expensive.
Of course.
And it became a problem then that when Detroit were no longer getting the income of federal aid, that the city started to fall apart. Now, that was not helped by January, the beginning of the book, which begins with the worst snowstorm in Detroit's history, where in actual fact the mayor of Detroit, Jerome Kavanagh, is left with this, for the first time ever, a huge deficit in public funding, brought about largely by them having to clear the roads and put out kind of 24-hour road clearance projects and things like that, losing work because people were going elsewhere because you couldn't move around in Detroit. A lot of the car plants were closed for days on end. So that damaged the kind of, if you like, the social economy of the city, which then wasn't getting the money from central government, and the whole thing started to kind of, collapse from there. By the summer, when the riots kick in, of course, it becomes a city known for notoriety and for decline and decay, and eventually, ultimately, decades later, bankruptcy. So it's a terribly sad story of how a city can fall into that kind of decay.
And very quickly as well.
Yeah, really quickly. And a city that probably a lot of people would have said, certainly if you were living in Scotland, you would have said that Detroit, with the motor industry, and that was something that central Scotland aspired to.
Exactly.
In fact, ironically, the big plant that we had at the time, Linwood, the actual village of Linwood was called after a street in Detroit, Linwood Avenue, which was the headquarters of Chrysler, and when they opened their plants in the UK, it became the Linwood plant, simply because that's what their address was in Detroit. Now, we assume in Scotland that somehow it was always called Linwood.
Yeah, there's a place called Linwood.
Exactly. It's a plant called Linwood, and that closed as well,
Of course.
Yeah.
Central to this is the huge character of Berry Gordy in terms of Motown.
Yes.
And he seems to be a man struggling to come to terms with the times. There's the hippie movement are coming in.
Yeah, and he's pretty much against that countercultural scene.
Exactly.
And I think that there's a kind of rationale for that, because I tried. Somebody said to me in the book, "Come on then, who's the baddie?" And I thought, there isn't a baddie, and there isn't truly a goodie either.
James Brown doesn't come out too well.
James Brown comes out of it very badly. He's probably my token baddie, right? But the thing is that Berry Gordy had this idea that he had watched. He'd had a small jazz shop in Detroit that he'd set up, and had gone bust, and he'd been bankrupted out of that business. Although he's from a very wealthy family, so it didn't really impact him too much. But he was working in the car plants at the time, and he'd become aware of the fact that black American music, the blues, jazz, he was aware of how poor distribution was, and how they were actually increasingly marginalised from the stores that really sold records in volume, whether they were Woolworths or whether they were kind of high street or mall stores across America. And he had this belief that black American music, particularly the kind of funk traditions or the R&B traditions of kind of ghetto music, had also in a way, almost kind of discriminated against themselves, that actually ghettoised themselves by never ever kind of understanding that music also had to have other things going for it. Now, it's quite a hard thing to understand that, but he believed that Motown had to reach into the mainstream rather than hide on the margins. Detroit was full of about, I think, probably number 300 small independent labels.
Incredible.
It's incredible. It was like a kaleidoscope of these labels, and they were all out there, many of them in the margins, people kind of selling records to the backs of motor cars, and people that have got kind of records that were barely kind of well produced. I mean, just like an indie sector in almost any culture. And it was a real kind of Klondike, but Motown hired two or three guys, but one guy that I talk a lot about in the book, who's a guy called Barney Alice, he's a Sicilian-American white man who they'd hired from, I think, Warner Brothers, and he built up an amazing network of distribution. And Berry Gordy believed that the only way that black American music would get sold in southern stores is if it was represented by white managers. So he went and hired white managers to make sure those stores would take stock, and you know, and things like that, where he was very, I think, cleverly trying to kind of say, if we want to stay in the ghetto, that's fine, but that's where we'll stay. If we want to break out of the ghetto, there's some compromises we're going to have to make, and here are some of the compromises. And I think that he softened. There was a generation of people that signed for Motown. There's a woman called Hattie Littles. There was a guy called Sing Sammy Ward, and they're kind of R&B singers. You go back to the early music, it's great, but it's quite gut bucket. It's a bit raw. They've got great voices, but it's sandpaper soul. You know what I mean? And he wanted people who were smoother, more supper club, more eloquent, a bit of showbiz, a bit of Las Vegas. And he took on the national networks for television, Las Vegas itself. The kind of the holiday resorts. He would put artists in all of those places where white America would see them and where they could therefore cross over. Now, some people would see that as a compromise. Other people would see it as the greatest strategic move he ever made. So you pay your money, you take your choice.
There's a great phrase in there about the way he presented the Supremes as pop girls, pop geishas. And when you see them on stage, it was that
sort of thing. And we are here to serve. I mean, it was actually quite interesting about some of the things that he did. He was a great... Firstly, I think one of the things that he was fantastic at was that he understood Fordism, or kind of the Taylorist system of division of labour, which was a big thing in Detroit. It was all over the city, as being discussed in every pub, and this whole idea of you only do that job and you do it to perfection and you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And that's kind of what's in the Motown creative system. There was very little kind of... Marvin Gaye sometimes could buck the system, but very few others. Most people, you were hired as a saxophonist, you did your shift and you went. And then you went to a bar and you moonlighted and you got a wee bit of money. They come back the next day and you were still a saxophonist, and you were still expected to do a 30-second sax solo in the middle of... And that's how they composed things. I mean, much like Berry Gordy himself had worked putting in the glove departments on the fronts of cars, and that was his job, And he realised that was how music could be made. And so at Motown to this time, I mean, it's quite interesting that they made lots and lots of backing tracks which were reused endless times on with a different artist, and almost every record. This morning, actually, I was listening to a whole load of unissued Motown I've got that through the northern soul scene, either on tape or on acetate disc. And you sit and you think, even this morning, I thought I knew a lot about soul, and it was a really big one. It was something like What Become of the Broken Hearted or something. I can't remember what it was now, the song I was listening to, and I thought, this is really good. Who's singing this? And it was Jimmy Ruffin. I didn't even know he'd done it. Well, he'd never been issued, so how would you know? But basically, as soon as somebody's session was finished, they'd come in, there'd be another 2 hours, and Jimmy Ruffin would have the same band as the previous ones. He'd have a go at it, and the best one got released, or what they perceived was the best one got released, That's
the other thing, is the amount of music that was being made back then was incredible.
Unbelievable. I mean, you're talking about, I also liked, one of the researches I did was I had all the Motown release schedule of what was being released on what day, who was in the studio on what days, and you can counterweave stories then, because there's one story I tell about the assassination three young guys who are killed. It's in the August chapter, and they're killed by a rogue unit of the Detroit police on the last day of the urban riots. And these kids are murdered. I mean, much like some of the things that have been going on recently, where their families never get satisfaction. There isn't a reasonable kind of court case or anything like that. Mistrials, all sorts of things. So I'd written a lot about that, but I also knew that when they arrested these two kids, there was also another murder of a police band leader's son, and when they arrested the two guys, I knew from the arrest warrants that they were arrested at exactly the same moment that the Supremes sacked Florence Ballard. So you can juxtapose two entirely disconnected stories, and they happen simultaneously, and it enriches, I think, the story of the book, because you're following a murder mystery, and suddenly you're back to the Supremes and she's been sacked, and you're back to a murder mystery again, and it gives context, I think, wider context to a story.
Oh, absolutely. That's what runs through the book, is this wider context, and you can understand, I think, that Berry Gordy's not just coming to terms with all these changes and the changes in Detroit, but also the changes in having a successful group of artists who suddenly, they're not going to just say, well, I get paid the same wage for the thing I did yesterday.
I want, and the biggest one he faced actually was that by far and away in 1965, more revenue was generated for the Motown Corporation by the Writers Holland Dozier in Holland, and not unreasonably, as would happen if they were working in a TV independent or a publishing company. Suddenly they start to say, well, we're making the revenue for the company, why don't we share in the share issue? Now, Berry Gordy had been always the single share owner of the Motown Corporation, and with his sister had been the owner of the Gibet publishing group within the Motown Corporation, and it was against his family's kind of beliefs that you diluted the share of the ownership of what they considered to be a family business, and so he was quite hostile to diluting shares. And it may well have been that he just simply called it slightly wrong, or maybe he didn't find the right way of compensating those men at that time, but they were asking for a chunk of what he believed was his business. He'd put up the risk capital, he'd been there when they weren't around, and they were actually all three of them failed singers that he'd subsidised at some parts of their life. So there was all sorts of tensions going on. But the other thing I would say, and this is not in defence of Berry Gordy, he had, I remember telling this story actually in relationship to Still Game. Now there's something that completely and utterly are unconnected, right? The history of Motown in Detroit and the history of Still Game in Scotland. One of the reasons I was mentioning it to is one of the executives at the company that developed Still Game at the comedy unit had been reading the book in its pre-publication state, and she had been struck by an argument that Berry Gordy had put forward, which is that artists have to take responsibility for studio time. The studio time has a cost, right? Yeah. If you're going into the studio to record a record, that has a cost attached to it. When the record is released and starts to make an income or a profit, there's a cost attached to making the record, and that has to come off before the artist is in profit, if you like. It should be similar in publishing and whatever. And I remember her saying to me, oh God, I'm not sure I could ever get away with that argument with Ford and Gregg, meaning it's Still Game. Now, she was joking, but she was actually making a really important point, which is, I think that in advance of that company had funded 3 or 4 pilots that went nowhere as risk pilots with that talent, with that staff, some of which was paid for by BBC Scotland, but some of which was deficit funded by the company. And it gets to a stage where if you're really running a creative business, you have to look at the ways in which you can make that work commercially, because if it's always just about the artists getting what they want, then your business is fucked.
Absolutely. And you can't have Stone Roses taking 5 years to make a follow-up album.
Correct, because it doesn't matter because the studio's just going to be like a meter and it don't keep ticking. The company will pay for that. I don't think that's a fair creative balance. And Berry Gordy certainly believed that.
No, he did. I mean, he thought you wouldn't be here at all if it wasn't for me funding you.
But I want you to be well paid. Where he maybe made the mistake was it became very, very volatile. Now, I can bring this back directly to Scotland. Scotland's been referred to once or twice in the book, not a lot, but there's one bit in the book where James Jamerson of the Funk Brothers had been quite influential on the Holland brothers, Brian and Eddie Holland of Holland, Dozier and Holland. Everybody in Detroit's interested in the trade union movement because the unions, particularly the negotiation around the car contracts, was an annual ritual, and Walter Reuter, the head of the car union, the United Automobile Workers, was a big presence within the city. He was probably as big, if not bigger, than the mayor and all of that. Now, the number two to Walter Reuter was a guy from Paisley called Doug Fraser, right? And he was the number one negotiator for the UAW. So he was by some distance the, if you like, the grassroots person that the trade unionists or the wildcat strikers communicated with. You know, if a shop steward downed tools because of a dispute at that plant, Doug Fraser would be in working out where the union's position was and he was quite a big figure. Now, I found out, and it was actually soon after, just as I was going to publication with the book, that James Jamerson of the Funk Brothers, who is by some distance probably the senior musician of the Motown stable, had created this illusion or delusion that he was Scottish, right? Now, in fact, he was from North Carolina, right, and black, and was not Scottish, right? But he perfected this growly Scottish accent. And he would shout at people over the studio, "Get that done now," right? And I'd actually asked a woman who I'm in touch with, who's a backing singer for the Andantes, the Motown book, and she was online, and I said, James had this thing that he said he was a Highlander or a Scot or whatever. He said, yeah, he used to shout in this gruff accent, but I don't know where it came from, because at times he said he was Irish and then he was Scottish, and no one really quite believed him, but when he was a heavy drinker and he liked raw whiskey, and he claimed that it was his, cultural right to drink it on duty and all that. So he's this bizarre character. But it was only a bit later, I'd been in touch with Lamont Dozier, who had been part of the dispute with Gordy, and he'd gone on strike with the Holland brothers, and he said to me, do you know what I think it was that he kept listening to the Scottish man that was the car worker on local radio, and he thought that if you were in dispute with your manager, you spoke like that. That was what he conceived a union leader to be, and he imitated Doug Fraser's accent, basically. Now, it's kind of weird that, because here's a man from Paisley who's migrated to Detroit, got a job through the union, worked his way up to the top of the hierarchy, but still got a really good West of Scotland accent. And a Motown musician is thinking, that's how you argue with your boss in an accent like that. Now, he was actually the union negotiator for Motown, James Jamerson. In fact, the first ever strike they had was in Renfield Street, 1965, when they'd come to the end of that, what was actually a pretty disastrous tour, and they were wanting more cash in hand, and Berry Gordy had to get money wired into a bank, I think it was a British Linen Bank or something, in Renfield Street, to pay them the money to go on stage that night in Glasgow, and so him and another guy called Earl Van Dyke, who was a keyboardist, were the only two people that the studio musicians believed had ever won a fight with Gordy. So they became these characters that always were at the front of disputes and all the rest of it. And you started to see Motown almost as a kind of a union plant, where, and later on in life, I've got the circulation for, there was a voice paper, a black voice paper that came from the campus of Wayne State University, and that was a much more radical black power publication rather than a union-led one, although it was quite Marxist, quite a Maoist paper as well. And I you look down this is at Wayne State University, down the circulation list, and there's Marvin Gaye on the list of people that got the magazine, So he was having to deal with all of these currents of thought that were around as well. And he was a businessman. He was still trying to, he was still winning awards for Black Businessman of the Year and African American Entrepreneur of the Year, dealing with all these crazy heads that were, some of them were off their skull, and some of whom thought they were Scottish and weren't. Couldn't have been easy.
Marvin Gaye himself's an interesting character, because I often wondered, how did he go from being the kind of archetypal soul singer, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, to then what's going on a few years later, a really political album. And this kind of explains it. The book explains it.
Yeah, it does, because it also places him in that context of change, and also you see around him many things happening. Not least with his own personal life, but an awful lot of things that you see happening. And probably the big influence there was that his brother, Frankie Gay, was in active service in Vietnam, and actually was in a unit that was trapped out in a kind of jungle area in the kind of one of the delta areas of Vietnam, and he was almost literally having to hide for days on end, submerged in jungle, in a delta jungle, underwater, or at least mostly underwater. And he'd written a series of letters back to Marvin at Motown, who of course was now internationally famous, and so having Marvin Gaye as your brother, they were in touch with each other all the time. And I had a wee bit of a kind of strange but wonderful experience one night when I was a student in Washington DC. There was a Marvin Gaye memorial night. He was by now dead. Yep. I was a student in DC, and I saw this Marvin Gaye memorial night, Washington homecoming of the great Marvin Gaye, 10th anniversary of death or whatever it was, and it says original songs sung by his brother Frankie Gay, who was a very good singer actually. So I thought, I'm going to go along to that, but it was quite aimed at a kind of black nightclub sort of older African American audience, right. So I was going to be, for the first time in my life, a bit young and very white, or red raw. And so I went into this bar in Washington DC, a supper club bar, and you could either sit at a table and they bring you waiter service, or go to the bar, in which case it was cheaper. So I thought, I'll take a seat at the bar and see where it goes. Everybody in the whole bar were probably in their 40s and were black, and they were out in the big finery and everything, zoot stuff and everything. It was great, And I looked over at the other side of the bar. I mean, literally at the end of the bar, here was this white woman with longish auburn hair. And I thought, oh, don't be crass, don't go, hello, are you white? Can I sit next to you? I mean, it was just embarrassing. So anyway, I just said, can I have a beer, please? And the guy said, you want a Miller Lite? You want a Budweiser? Got you right through the menu. And like, oh, stop. The cheapest one, please. It was that guy. So anyway, I said, I'll take a Budweiser there, a bottle of Budweiser, and I was pointing away. And here this voice comes over the bar. Are you Scottish? And I said, yes. And she said, come over here. And it was a woman from Aberdeen, right? And she was at the bar, and she said, I want you to come backstage now and meet my husband, Frankie Gay. And I was and Frankie Gay had married a girl from Scotland who he'd met in the States, who was from Aberdeen, and she took me backstage. Now, they were staying in an apartment in Washington DC for the run of this thing, a hired apartment, and they took me back to the apartment with some other band members and other people, and I sat down and I spoke to Frankie at length, and he had with him, which I think was probably his party piece, was this kind of plastic folder of letters from Marvin Gaye and Frankie Gay to Marvin Gaye, that he'd got when Marvin passed away. He'd got all the letters back, but he also had his copies of the letters Marvin had sent him when he was in Vietnam. And he said, I've not marked them, but I want to point you out in pencil some of these things. And he started to point out to me lines and words from what's going on. Wow. Where he had taken, almost like Bowie used to do, a collage of stuff from his brother's letters, And it was Frankie's belief that the beginning of the song, brother, 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 let me tell you what's going on across this land, was not the generic brother of kind of the street language for African American guys. It was a brother, his brother. And it was almost like his testimony, and all the references to Vietnam and the trigger happy police thing and things like that. The trigger happy police comment comes from the killing of the young men in the August of 1967, where one of the prominent African American politicians of the time talked about the Detroit police being trigger happy, and then that comes up, and so you can see almost like he's surfing the newspapers and the correspondence of that era and making this fantastic, I think the greatest concept album in the history of recorded music. It's just immense, because it sits somewhere between social comment and trying to redefine Christianity in a world where you can't quite believe in God the way that what you maybe once did as a kid, but he's also kind of getting into quite kind of spiritual stuff like Save the Children and all of that. It's an immensely deep and complex album, It's beautifully sung and everything.
It's incredible, and it shouldn't work, the amount of layers that are on it.
It shouldn't, it should fall over, shouldn't it? But it's great,
He seems to be particularly affected by the demise of Tammy Terrell. You touched on it earlier on, and that's, there's a lot of tragedy in the book, but that is particularly tragic.
Hugely tragic, because I think that he was going through a very difficult time with his he's gone through a very difficult time with his wife, who's Barry's sister, and who's slightly older than her. She was desperately keen to have children.
Yep.
And eventually they had a child that most people now say was was actually their niece's child that Marvin Gaye had given. She'd given birth to a child surrogate on their behalf. Now, how that was achieved, whether it was done medically or whether it was done through consensual sex or whatever, I don't know, and I maybe never will know.
Yeah.
But that's now the settled kind of truth that she was really keen to have this child, and eventually they did. But it was never, by this time it was a marriage where love had been lost. And his next concept album, Here My Dear, is actually the divorce album. So I mean, there was a lot of bitterness between them, and they were living in Berry Gordy's house in a place called Monica Drive, and I sort of feel sometimes, you know, when I was researching the book and I was in Detroit, I went to the corner of it's called Outer Drive in Monica. It's an intersection in a suburban area of Detroit, near a place called Palmer Park. And I always remember that I would get a taxi driver would drop me off, and I'd walk along the blocks, and I'd walk maybe 10 streets, 10 kind of doors along, and then come back again and kind of look over the wall and look in the, trying to get a kind of thing of where they live. Now, they'd long since moved out. Yeah. But I remember one woman come at the door saying, "Are you looking for something?" You're thinking, "No, I'm just a nosy bastard, Mrs. But I said, "Look, I'm a student, I'm doing some work in this area," and la la la. But, there was things that were quite important, because during the snowstorm, I'd remembered Marvin Gaye saying that he looked out his window and there was just a sheet of white snow in the median, the kind of part in the middle of the road, and it was just very kind of odd that you could go there. He also liked playing baseball between the cars, and he would throw his baseball or his football or whatever, and it was just nice getting a physical picture of where all that was happening. There's a great photograph of him standing in the alleyway. And from there I could work out that it was still the same tree and still the same, triangle above the door. So things that were, at one level quite kind of geeky, but it gave me a feeling that my research was meaningful,
Sure.
But he had been quite a loveless house for them to live in, and I think really he was never, or at least I could never get any evidence that he was ever sexually attracted to or sexually in love with Tammy Terrell.
No.
But they were deeply spiritually in love in a broader sense, and I think much in the same way that great kind of partnerships often are, that you actually build up almost a kind of need and a reliance on that other person, because they know the moves, they know the routines, they know your weaknesses and your strengths, they know when you can improvise and when you can't, and she was just absolutely brilliant for him. And they were the great duet singer. When she collapsed, first and foremost, myth has it that she fell into his arms and whatever, and that was the kind of romancing of it. In actual fact, they were opposite sides of the stage, and he wasn't quite sure if she'd fallen or not fallen, and he knew she hadn't been very well, but that was not uncommon for her to be quite sleepy and whatever, But the curious thing about that was I told the story of her falling apart through kind of three different things. One of which was, I went back to the students who'd organised it through their student magazine. I've tracked down one of the guys who'd organised it through the student university, and I spoke to him at length on the phone call. And then, curiously enough, my partner, who's a Sri Lankan Tamil, has a friend who is one of Sri Lanka's biggest kind of neurological surgeons, and who is a world expert on the neurological disorder that Tammy Terrell had. Okay. So I was all the time corresponding with this woman saying, give me some symptoms. If somebody was at this stage and what would their behaviour like? So she was giving me all these kind of things about kind of, dizziness, about, being sort of unsettled and putting on weight. And so I was able to kind of almost sort of guess what Tammy Terrell was going through. Her sister then brought out a rather good, but a bit kind of sort of quite a thin book, but it's a book about her sister. It's a love letter to her sister. But she was pretty decent with me, and I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, "Look, easiest thing in the world would for me to say, oh, they loved each other and they were upstairs shagging every night, and but it just wasn't like that, and there's just no point. And she says, if I thought that there was any value in telling that story, I'd written a book, I would have said it. Do you know what I mean? But actually, it wasn't true, and the true story was better.
It's much better, absolutely. Because he almost becomes a recluse after it, doesn't it? I mean, he, as you say, there's other things going on in his life.
But he drops into a depression and actually becomes deeply reclusive. And then maybe it's the case that What's Going On album couldn't have been written by the previous Marvin Gaye. I mean, there's a psychological thing there about he was quite a crooner, he was out there, he was doing Las Vegas, he was a cool guy, money was no object, women was not an object, and I think there was a side of him started to interiorise in the way that sometimes poets do, that it becomes about what's inside them as much as what they can witness out there, So he was dealing with this social album that is also deeply interiorised and personal, I mean, it's just brilliant, If anybody that's not heard that, they should just go and buy it,
Definitely, it should be.
It should be obligatory, And then, of course, other things that are out there as well, like Lanark by Alistair Gray. There's a whole range of big concepts out there you can buy. They're not all in Detroit.
Reading Lanark and listening to What's Going On,
That's the way to do
it. That's a perfect afternoon. Something else that puts the book into perspective is the cameos by other people. Muhammad Ali. There's a great chapter heading called Muhammad Ali versus the Supremes, which is fantastic. And you've also got Rosa Parks at some point.
Rosa Parks, she pops up, She pops up in I think quite, strangely enough, without kind of going into the exclusive detail of this, I'm working with a company who are representing HBO, the TV company, on the August of the book, which is where Rosa Parks appears, right? Wow. And what it is really is that the riots have happened. In the last hours of the riots, 3 young African-American men are killed by a rogue unit of the Detroit police who, if you follow their story in the previous 38 hours, have been responsible for the deaths of maybe 2 other men, but have also been the victims of one of their team dying in the riots as well. So it's a very complex set of circumstances. But the main leader of it, a guy called David Senak, who's a police officer, is clearly now tipped into being, quite an ugly kind of racist character. He's worked undercover in the Vice Squad. He blames young African-American men, and particularly a number of nightclubs, one called the 20 Grand, another called the Algiers Motel, as being the epicentre of kind of pimps and prostitution and cocaine dealing and things like that. And some of that's true. A lot of that's true, but, it tips into this quite kind of ugly racism in his mind. Now, the irony of the situation is he'd been in the same class as Diana Ross throughout his high school, So all of these weird kind of things that are going on. Now, what happens then is the brother of one of the 3 dead kids starts to suspect that his brother's been killed, and that this effect of kind of, assassination has happened, or the police have just gone in and killed these kids. And after the riots, there was a lot of suspicion by African Americans that they couldn't go to the police to report crimes because the police were part of the problem, as it were. So the Conyers, who was their local senator, set up an office and said, if you have to register a crime, this might be a very kind of small thing, like your liquor store got the window smashed, or your back, or the trees at the back of your house were burnt, or whatever it was, and you need to make a claim on your insurance, or you have to defend yourself against your landlord for damages or whatever, come and register it with our office, and we'll keep a record of it, and that will be tacit to you reporting it to the police, and we'll then go and report these things to the police kind of en masse, if you like, which they did. Now, there's a queue right round his block, and his office was it's actually a trade union hall. It was not far from Motown's studio, and they queued round the block, including the brother of the assassinated kid, who then said that his first words were, "I think my brother has been murdered by the Detroit police." They're his opening lines. But he's sitting down and telling this to an old woman who's the secretary to it, who's joined the secretariat of this reporting of crimes. Now, she is by this time Rosa Parks, the famous Rosa Parks, and she's working as a volunteer for the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People in Detroit, where she's migrated to, having been part of the civil rights movement in the southern states earlier in her life. And so she's sitting there recording this crime. So that's the thing that HBO are interested in, where you have a young African-American man who's only in his early 20s beginning to become a detective to investigate the murder of his own brother, and his assistant or mentor is Rosa Parks, you know. So it's got a nice kind of cinematic feel to it. So. So I'm discussing that just now, but I mean, it's a way off anything happening, but, so it's been great, and, I've got other books to write and everything, so...
The book is the first part of a trilogy, I believe.
It is, yes. We've got Memphis 68, and then I want to do a thing in Harlem, but I've been kind of usurped by a publisher as well, who's asked me to do the social history of the Northern Soul scene in Britain.
Okay.
That's the social history of the UK, the North-South divide. There's a whole lot of things connected to the miners' strike, to the Ripper inquiry. I mean, there's a whole set of things.
Oh, wow.
So it tells a social history of Britain from about 1967 through to maybe about the late 80s, and against a backdrop of all sorts of political change and, things going on. And it's the story of how Northern Soul evolved and how it came about and what its kind of meanings were and whatever. So I've been doing a lot of that's coming out next, and then I'll jump to Memphis.
Well, Stuart, that's the perfect place to leave it. Thanks so much for doing that.
Absolute pleasure. Really nice to speak to you.
Cheers.
So good luck and everything.
Thanks very much.
We'll stay in touch. All right. I'm just going to have to jump now because we're on air in a minute.
Okay.
I see the Eamon's there. So.
Thanks again. Cheers.
See you. All the best.
Cheers now, Stuart. And we'll be back next time with someone completely different. Cheers.